In Daniel Cormier versus Stipe Miocic 3, we saw the conclusion of a thrilling trilogy to find out who was the baddest man on the planet, the heavyweight king, the heavyweight champion. Did it live up to the hype? I'm not too sure. Look, what we definitely were treated with was with a really competitive fight. It was really competitive for all the 5 rounds. While I think the prevailing wisdom saw probably Stipe Miocic taking this, it was competitive. For all 5 rounds, it was competitive. I think, when I digest it and look at this, there's a couple of narratives that played true, but to me, it was what didn't really happen that quite resonated with me. We didn't see a lot of the body shots of Stipe. It was a smaller octagon. He mixed it up with really good striking. The clinch work was really good by Stipe. He had those underhooks, and he was able to strategically add elements of rest throughout the period of the fight that kept him fresh, that kept him allowing to, use his jabs, use his boxing punches to really good effect, right? And the other narrative that really prevailed was, DC and the lack of the ability for him to take down Stipe. I mean, in a lot of interviews, it was a prevailing wisdom that the DC was going to take, mixing the strikes, obviously, but going to take Stipe down. And this played out in the first round. He took Stipe down, which looked relatively easier with a single leg. He took him and controlled him. Stipe did get up, however. But, one thought that, off the back of how easy that was to get there, that, DC was going to go to that well early and often, but he didn't. And interestingly enough, it could be one of two things. The distance in which this was fought was really in the pocket, but it was within boxing range within the pocket. And again, I think, you see these wrestlers that come in and really do fall in love with the punching. And I generally think that just DC didn't necessarily have the gas tank to administer a 5-round beatdown that required that was wrestling centric and wrestling based. I generally believe that just looking at the movements. But, look, all credit to Stipe, because he did come with a plan. He came with, leg kicks. He did mix up the variety there. The boxing was relatively crisp. There were a lot of periods throughout the time by both fighters where there was a little bit of white noise. There was a little bit of, not necessarily a staring contest, but pausing the action, so to speak. But when the action came, it did come thick and fast. I mean, DC came with amazing leg kicks as well. I think it was really turning into Stipe Miocic, and he acknowledged that at the conclusion of the fight and in a couple of the interviews. Even in the boxing realm, it was, it was relatively gritty in that particular regard. But in terms of the totality, Stipe was definitely winning those exchanges. He was getting towards the end of that. He was very strategic in terms of the way that he was throwing the heat. And I think, one of the real, pain points and one of the real conclusions of the fight that nearly ended it was in round 2 when Stipe had DC, backtracking, and he caught him with a good hook. And he really had DC against the fence. He had DC lying on the ground, and man, it was, 10 to 15 seconds. And if that was longer, that was probably it. That was probably it for me. He had DC controlled quite well from the legs, and he was just rounding, strikes from the top. And I think that really was the beginning of the end for DC. He came in terms of the 3rd round. There were the normal boxing exchanges to which, DC did have his moments in that particular regard, but it was Stipe. It was a Stipe show there. But can we not, we can't talk about this fight and not talk about the eye poke. So obviously towards the conclusion of the 3rd round, in real time, we didn't necessarily see it, but towards the conclusion of the round, we see DC walking away, yelling and saying that he got his eye poked. Upon looking at the replay, we could see it. It was accidental. But man, when he came into the 4th round, you could definitely see the impact that it had visibly on DC's eye. And, throughout the fight, there were just punches that DC was not seeing. At the, upon the interview with Joe Rogan and various other media outlets, he has noted that he absolutely couldn't see from that particular eye. And really, that was the beginning of the end. Obviously, not intentional by Stipe. He was winning the fight. And in DC's credit, there were elements where he actually, with a couple of 1-2s, was straightening Stipe up in the punching department. But really, that was the beginning of the end. In what was, I don't know, maybe it was because a DC win would have cemented a really good story, but I just felt that there was not, there's an appreciation in terms of the art form that was placed there, but there's something hollow about this victory, at least to me. Can you take it away from Stipe? Absolutely not. He came in with a great plan. The clinch work was phenomenal, and Dom and Joe were talking about it, but Stipe wears a punch very well. He can take damage very well, and he's got to be up there in terms of the UFC for best gas tanks. He's got to have the best gas tank in the heavyweight division. So to me, I'm really intrigued to see Stipe versus Ngannou too. To me, that's the fight. But just by virtue of how good Stipe's gas tank is, I really want to see that. DC, he's a legend. He's a legend of the sport, and it's obviously heartbreaking to see him lose that way. That way meaning, as convincingly as it was. Yeah, he didn't look slower, but definitely age has caught up, and I think in the cardio element is where you can definitely sort of see it. I generally believe that he just did not have the gas tank to employ a wrestling centric attack. There was probably a lack of explosion there, which is interesting because he was the more explosive fighter when it came to the striking in terms of the speed, not the technicality, the speed. But it was an interesting fight, and he goes into the sunset with his head held up high. Rather, he's done a lot from the sport, and he's definitely not going to disappear. The shows that he has with Ariel, and obviously the commentary with the UFC, and let's fast forward a couple of years, and potentially we might be able to lure him back with a little grudge match with an individual named John Jones. But look, he's done amazing for himself, and can hold his head up high, especially even if that was his last fight. For Stipe, what a champion. Honestly, what a champion. He has beaten the who's who when it comes to the heavyweight division, and he has really cemented himself as an excellent bloke, but an amazing fighter in his own right. I did see a bit of the presser, and a little bit of his personality is starting to come out now, which is interesting. The Ngannou fight makes sense for me. It's Ngannou and John Jones, and to me, he should close that chapter. After those two fights, he doesn't have anything to prove. Rosenstrike, meh. I'm having a mind blank. The Black Beast, yeah, those fights do come, but I think for Stipe, it's legacy fights, and John Jones is a legacy fight. Ngannou, people want to see that. If he beats Ngannou, it's a wrap, in my opinion. Well, that was my synopsis of the fight and the futures of both these two fighters. Give us a thumbs up. Leave some comments below. Tell us what you think about it. Is Stipe the best heavyweight of all time? I think so. Chat soon, guys.